How's it going, guys? I'm back with another video here about website development, and today I'm going to show you the true power of CSS. And probably, again, I keep saying this is the most important lesson about website development that you're going to have, but this is the most important lesson that you're going to have about CSS. And I know that maybe most people don't like CSS because they don't know about this feature, but today, I'm going to go over the best thing ever, and that is display flex. So, Mozilla Firefox defines Flexbox or display flex as a one-dimensional layout method for arranging items in rows or columns. Basically, what this means is it is a method that you use to style your website in the exact way that you want. So, aside from like changing the width or height of things or changing the color of the border or color of the text, display flex is used to change the position of elements in your website. And you'll basically find yourself using display flex when styling divs. Remember that a div is a container that you put different elements inside, and basically display flex is adjusting the position of the different elements inside the div. So some important properties of display flex are 1, flexed direction, 2, justify content, 3, align items, and 4, gap. So let me show you an example here with the cyber lines. So looking here, you'll notice that everything, first of all, is surrounded by a main div. So this is the main div. My spelling is kind of ugly here, but that's fine. And then inside this main div is another div. Here is another div. We'll call this like second div. This is second div. And then here lastly there is an image. So that's how all the elements are laid out inside this snippet. And basically, when you use display flex, you're going to use display flex in this main div. So in your styles.css, you would put display flex here for this main div, and then using the properties that I just mentioned earlier, 4 important properties: flex direction, justify content, align items, and gap. First of all, the flex direction, you can either have your elements in columns or in rows. And by default, when you put in your HTML code, everything is going to be in a column. So like up and down, if you think of like a tower or something and different stories, your elements are going to be laid out vertically like that. But in this example, all the content inside this main div is displayed inside a row. So instead of down to up, you're going to have it left to right. And that means that flex direction here would be flex direction row instead of flex direction column. Justify content and align items. Basically, you justify content to the center and then you align items to center. So knowing that flex direction is a row, when you justify content, your content is going to shift to the middle vertically. And then when you align items, your content is going to align to the center vertically. So it's going to move like this. When you justify content to center, then all the elements that are next to each other, they're going to shift to the right, to the center. So everything is aligned here. It is aligned evenly here when you justify your content. And then when you align items to center, instead of being like all at the top, they're going to move more to the middle so that these two are equal to each other. And then finally, gap. Basically, what gap means is you literally create a gap right here. Visualize it right here. Let's say, for example, this is 20 pixels. So this second div and the image are going to be both 20 pixels apart. But you'll notice that since I justified content to the center and aligned item to center, these are still going to be equal to each other. So we won't have a problem here. It looks symmetrical all around and it looks really neat. Okay, so let's pull up a real example instead of this image here. So I've made the default setup HTML for you guys here, and we're going to turn this HTML into this. And here is the default code. Here is the HTML that I made. As you can see, everything is surrounded by a main div, and then there is a secondary div here with the H1 in the paragraph, and then on the side, still inside the main div, is the image here. So that is all the code that we have for our HTML. That's all we really need to do for HTML. Now we're going to go over and edit the CSS. So what I have here, you don't need to have this code, it's just setup code. But basically, I'll go over it. This is so that I can have the same font family here as this. This is using Times New Roman as default, but I wanted to have this font, and this is what I will use to get that font. And here, everything is surrounded by a body, and I made this just because I wanted the content to be all in the center for you guys, so it's easier to look at. And as you can see, if I delete this, for example, you'll notice that everything just goes to the top left corner. I just wanted to put it in the center for you guys, but you guys don't need to do that. And then here, I changed the image to have a max width of 300 pixels so that it doesn't take up the entire page like this. So let's get started with our code. Remember that the important properties that we're learning with display flex are flex direction, justify content, align items, and gap. So the first thing I would do here is to change the flex direction to row instead of columns. And as you can see here, boom, it went from up and down to left and right now. And we're already making progress. It's starting to look really similar already. Now, what I would do is create, let's say, a max width of not 100 pixels, let's say 1,000 pixels, so that it looks a little bit cleaner here instead of stretching out all the way at the end. Okay, now we gotta justify the content to center, and then we gotta align items center. And as you can see here, the content inside of this main div just moved so that it's aligned evenly with each other. Let me go ahead and at the top put asterisks and then make an outline of 1 pixel solid red. So this asterisk means wildcard, which also means take everything, and then this outline means create a border around every single element here. And I'll do that just because it helps you better visualize all of the divs and all of the elements that are going on. And as you can see here, if I remove the justify content center and align item center, you'll see that it's not aligned properly to be right in the center, but once I do that, it is centered for you guys. So the next thing I would do is create a gap, let's say 30 pixels. And boom, as you can see here, this gap is created from the 2 elements inside of the main div. So the secondary div and then this image are separated by 20 pixels. And it's looking pretty good so far, if you ask me. Let's change this image to 500 pixels instead, so that it's a little bit bigger. And now that it's a little bigger, let's change this to 1200 so there's some more space. And now I would create styling for a secondary div. And what I want to do here is also use display flex. So if you notice, secondary div is a div in itself, and we use display flex on divs. So the reason I use display flex for the secondary div is because I want to have an even gap here of let's say 30 pixels, so that it looks nicer. That's all it really comes down to. And let's do that right now. Let's make a gap of 30 pixels. As you can see here, it's evenly aligned to be 30 pixels. If I look inside the inspect tool, you can see everything that's going on. If I remove flex column, it's going to be row by default when I use display flex. But if I don't use display flex, it's going to be column by default. So that's a good thing to know as well. Let's remove this wildcard, or I'm going to comment it out so it looks easier on your eyes. And instead of a 30 pixel gap, let's make it 20 pixels. And then let's change the font of this so that it looks even, and then let's change the font size of it so it looks nicer as well. The first thing I would do here is go to the main div and then change the font family to be Lato, and then have a backup font of sans serif. Basically what this property does is change the font of your code, and then if this code or if this font does not work, then it's going to have a default font, and I use sans serif as a default font, although there are many different types that you can use. And now if I refresh the code, look at that, it's starting to really look similar to each other. In our secondary div, let's change the actually no, we don't need to touch the secondary div, we need to touch the element inside the secondary div. So let's go here, I'm going to go inside the secondary div and then go find the element h1 inside of this secondary div. And what I want to do here is change the font size to like 40 pixels, so it's a little bit bigger, and then go back inside secondary div, this time go to paragraph specifically, and then change the font size of this to like 20 pixels. And as you can see here, each one of the elements inside of this secondary div, so the h1 here and then the paragraph or p here, they have different font sizes because I styled it that way. If I just went to secondary div in general and then I changed the font size to like 40, then both the header and the paragraph are going to have font sizes of 40 pixels. And now, once again, it's starting to look similar. This line spacing in between the text is kind of small, so let's go into the secondary div and then change the line's height to like 15 pixels instead. No, 15 pixels is way too small. How about 25 pixels? That's still small. Let's say 35, 50. There you go. Okay, it's actually looking even better than before. It gets better and better every time. But as you notice here, the width of this text is kind of big. Well, here it's a little bit smaller. So let's go ahead and go to the secondary div and then change the max width to like 500 pixels instead. There you go. It looks a little bit smaller now, so that all the content is squished into 500 pixels instead of its max pixels as before. And the gap is starting to look a little bit bigger, so let's change it. Oh, and one more thing. You should know that by default, I would do wildcard. I would do padding 0 and then margin 0, because by default, all elements in your HTML and CSS is going to have a little bit of padding and a little bit of margin. So as you can see here, it's all squeezed down a little bit better. There's no padding and then there's no margin. I'll have a video about padding and margin later, but just know that that's good practice to use wildcard, padding 0, margin 0 in the beginning of your setup code. So there's that. It still doesn't look super correct. 35 here, and then this main div, let's say 50. Let's say 100. There we go. It's looking better. 650. And there you go. Starting to look really, really similar. We're not going to make it look exact, but we're just going to make it look close enough so that I can show you how good display flex really is. And now finally, let's go over and change the image. So we go to our line of image, and then we want to change the border radius of this to like 50 pixels. And what that basically does, it takes the corner of the image and then it curves it like by 50 pixels. So this total arc here would be 50 pixels long. This would be 50 pixels. This would be 50 pixels, and then this would be 50 pixels. It looks fairly accurate, and that is thanks to Display Flex. So let me show you what it looks like without any of the CSS again. It just looks like large, empty. You'll see that this is defaulted to columns, and it looks really ugly. But when you use Display Flex, boom, you make the website look however you want it. And I just can't stress how important Display Flex is and how this lesson is. So I want you guys to experiment with Display Flex on your own, because it is the best thing ever. And if you guys have any other questions about Display Flex, please let me know and I'll try to answer them for you. And that's it for today, guys. Have a good one.